Hello, class. This short PowerPoint is meant to provide you with a broad historical overview and general idea of utopia as a fictional form. The term utopia comes from Thomas More's novel of the same name, published in 1551, and is a pun on two Greek words, which mean good place and no place. More's blueprint utopia describes a fictive ideal society based around notions of equality, social harmony, economic prosperity, and political stability. The story, like many early fictive utopias, is told as a kind of travelogue. More's book is a good place to begin one's understanding of utopia because it's framed by three significant tropes we find in many utopias. It features an isolated place, visited and then reported on by that visitor. It's based on a more perfect ideal society, and it offers a blueprint for the imagined alternative society. Now, More's utopia is a planned community based on controlling individual impulses that could be destructive to the public good. There's no private property. Everyone basically wears the same clothes, so there's no envy of wealth or social status. There are no bars or places that might corrupt people. And there's no poverty, hunger, violence, or other social problems that were common to More's time. But, oddly enough, it does require a certain amount of slave labor to function. And individual freedoms, well, they're pretty limited. More's utopia is born out of a Christian worldview that reflects a confidence in humanity's capacity to reach a state of perfection. It's also inspired by the letters of Amerigo Vespucci and Christopher Columbus, explorers who were expanding European geographical horizons. And with these expanded horizons also comes the discovery of the other, not just different types of people, but different forms of civic organization. For those of you who are interested in working a little bit more with utopia, there are two excellent resources: the Cambridge Companion to Utopian Literature and the Utopia Reader, both of these edited by Gregory Claeys. Gregory Claeys is a name that you'll find very often in utopian scholarship. Now, even though More coined the term utopia, the idea goes back to ancient Greece and is nourished by myths of the Golden Age and other mythical and religious archetypes, such as the concept of the afterlife. This slide describes some early prefigurations of utopia. There's Plato's Republic from 375 BC, which is a Socratic dialogue, and its major concern is justice. St. Augustine's 5th century AD Christian philosophy surrounding New Jerusalem, which is more like an allotopia because it deals with the afterlife. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward from 1888 has a hero who wakes up in the year 2000 where and when the U.S. has been transformed into a socialist utopia. And this is actually an early Uchronia, which is an alternate history, or the good place in the future. William Norris's 1890 News from Nowhere was pretty much a response to Bellamy's Looking Backward. And with News from Nowhere, we begin to understand how shifts in consciousness, the individual consciousness and not just society, really take shape in so many of the critical utopias of the 20th century that we'll talk about in just a bit. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a utopia whose prosperity depends on the perpetual misery of one child. It's a great place for the contemporary reader especially to begin to unpack the philosophical energy that feeds utopian as well as dystopian fiction. And this is because it does a great job of providing both a classic blueprint and a kind of postmodern meditation on the costs or the impacts of alternatives to building better societies. In this way, utopias really help us understand who we are and what we value as a society. Because utopia is a neologism, a word or expression used as the root for the formation of new terms, I'd like to turn briefly to some of those terms. I'll focus here on ecotopia and heterotopia because I find these to be really useful in our current social milieu. In 1975, Ernest Callenbach wrote Ecotopia, which is basically an environmental conservation story. Now, ecotopia is a term for topias that deal with environmental conservation or environmental destruction. And environmental destruction is something that we're seeing a lot of these days in terms of the literature out there. A lot of these are called climate fiction, cli-fi. So even though Utopia is from 1975, there were probably earlier climate fiction novels, short stories out there. In fact, there certainly were. Heterotopia is an interesting concept that was theorized in terms of literature by the cultural theorist Michel Foucault. He talks about heterotopia as contradictory sites, microcosms linked with breaks in traditional time. They're not always accessible to everybody. These are counter sites, and they exist outside of all places. They're absolutely different from all the sites that they reflect and speak about. Their role is to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled. Sanctuaries are heterotopia. Some may say that borders, like the U.S.-Mexico border, is a heterotopic space. Festivals are heterotopic, honeymoons, ships, bars, cemeteries, prisons, worlds within worlds that mirror but also disturb the outer world. I'd like to continue the move into the 20th and 21st centuries to describe what many scholars call the critical utopia. These utopias are more realistic than early blueprint utopias like Thomas More's or Plato's Republic, or even later utopias like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland. Critical utopias focus more on processes of social and political change. Difference and imperfection often find their way into the society, and these might be more postmodern stories that involve a kind of break with existing conditions. Time becomes an interesting concept in the critical utopia. There's a lived complexity to the critical utopia, and we sometimes find authors altering not only narrative representations of utopia, but of history as well. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed and Octavia Butler's Dawn are good examples of the critical utopia. Theorists that describe aspects of these utopias include Ruth Levitas, Frederick Jameson, and Peter Fitting. Communitarian goals, personal issues, and history itself are often key in these fictions. So one important thing to keep in mind about the critical utopia is that they're very often emphasizing communitarian rather than personal goals and ideals. They're not these guided tours of new societies. They emphasize daily life. They address personal issues such as the hegemony of family structures, like the nuclear family, sexuality, heteronormative transgressions, psychological or economic structures of gender division under capital. In general, a lot of these attempt to imagine new societies in which all forms of human behavior are valorized and in which older, more traditional dichotomies are transformed. Finally, one thing to keep in mind when working with utopia and utopian forms is genre. Utopia and dystopia generally fall under the umbrella of the speculative, and the speculative or speculative fiction is very often framed by what-if questions. What if we continue to go on this path? And the speculative is a lens, then, that scrutinizes social dilemmas, current social dilemmas. This is why it's so important to understand that context, the time period in which a work of utopian or dystopian fiction is written. And cognitive estrangement is another thing that we have to remember. It's very important. It's key to understanding utopia and dystopia because it gives us that distance. But we also need to understand that utopias and dystopias are direct reflections of a time period in which that author lives. And that author is proposing certain changes in society based on the conditions of the society in which he or she is living. And again, remember, these desires are not perfect desires, but they're desires for more perfect societies. Finally, for those of you who are interested or when it comes time to work on papers, a couple of good resources that might be useful for you. Thanks for listening.